Okay, Senator Calzert, better late than never, right? You have a little proposition you'd like to present to us today?
Thank you so much for fitting me in your schedule, Mr. Chairman, and committee members for taking the time and effort to be here this late in the process. I know it's a hectic time. This is important to me and to our Republican caucus in the Senate. It's on our agenda of priorities for this session, and what it is an application. This Senate Resolution 673 is an application to the United States Congress to call a amendment convention of the states to propose a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution. As background, I think all of us that read anything in the press here lately understand what a financial crisis this country is in. We're to the point now where, in my view, we have a complete lack of fiscal responsibility at the federal level. 49 out of the 50 states, of course including Georgia, have either laws or constitutional provisions that call for a balanced budget. We live within our means, no matter how painful it is. And all of you that have been going through this recession with us the last few years realize the painful choices that we've had to make in the state of Georgia to live within our means. We just do not spend more, don't appropriate more than our tax revenues come in. The federal government does not have that type of requirement. And as a result, it does not balance its budget. This year, we expect that we're going to spend $1 trillion more than the revenues brought in by the federal government. Now, this is just going to further add to our national debt, which as of last year was $15.2 trillion. That's gone up $6 trillion just in the 4 years Obama has been in office. This equals $137,000 per taxpayer in this country of debt. And we are leaving this horrible legacy for our children and our grandchildren. We're saddling them with debt, and we're going to erode the financial stability of this country and the ability to spend money on what we need to. We've already had our debt downgraded. We're spending a huge percentage of our budget on debt service as it is, and I can only imagine how much higher of a percentage we're going to be spending on debt service as interest rates rise again. You got to remember, we're now at probably all-time lows on interest rates. As those rates rise, we're going to be in a real pickle. The Constitution of the United States has built into it two mechanisms, two ways to amend the Constitution. Of course, we've already had 27 amendments to the Constitution along the way, and it's intended to be a document that's fluid, that can change over time, to deal with the subjects and the issues that arise over time, but it's also intended to be very difficult to do. You have to have a strong consensus of the citizens of the United States before we can amend our Constitution. There are two methods of doing that. The first is the United States Congress can propose a constitutional amendment by a vote of Congress, but it takes a 2/3 vote of Congress to propose an amendment. Then that amendment, once passed by Congress, must be submitted to the states and ratified by 3/4 of the states. In this case, part of the debate over raising the debt ceiling back in the summer was that the Republican members of the United States Congress insisted that in exchange for raising the debt limit, the Congress would bring to a vote a balanced budget amendment. And that happened in December, and it did not pass the United States House of Representatives. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because Congress would be limiting their own authority, their own power, is that they're not currently limited, and you know how that is sitting in these chairs that we sit in. It's rare for us to do something to take power away from ourselves or flexibility from ourselves. But our founding fathers were smart enough to realize that there would be a second avenue for amending the Constitution, and it's ideally for situations where Congress does not want to amend it, where they're not going to do something to limit their own power. And it gives credence and honors the states' rights end of things, that we are a confederation of states is how we came to be the United States, and the states retain all powers that are not ceded to the federal government. Because of that, there's a second way to amend the United States Constitution, and if 2/3 of the states apply to Congress for a convention, an amendment convention to amend the Constitution, then they must call for that convention. The states then meet, and they may propose an amendment to the United States Constitution. If they elect to do so, it still has to be submitted to the states for ratification. We'll still require 3/4 of the states to ratify. So this amendment convention does not on its own amend the Constitution. It simply comes up with a proposed amendment to submit to the states. Now, this was a cornerstone of Ronald Reagan's first campaign for president in 1980 when he won. He was a strong fiscal conservative, and he was an advocate that we needed to amend the United States Constitution. There are letters, and we had these in committee in the Senate, where he was asking various state legislatures to pass a balanced budget amendment at that time. And I believe we came within either one or two states of reaching the two-thirds of states necessary. It requires 34 states, or two-thirds of the states, to ask for this amendment convention before it can take place. But it's not just a partisan issue. And for example, the state of Georgia, Representative Powell, when you were here, I guess, in 1976, this state was completely Democratic control. The state of Georgia passed an almost identical application for a balanced budget amendment at that time. And that stayed on the books for years and years. And then a few years back, we had 6 or 7 different types of constitutional amendments that we had applied for or called for. They had to kind of clean up the books day and rescinded legislation that was outdated or unintended or no longer desired, and all of those were rescinded, all 6 or 7 of our constitutional amendment applications. So we got a clean slate again. But I mention that only to show that this is not a partisan issue, that as recently as 30 years ago, this state, completely in Democratic control, was asking for the same thing. And of course, Ronald Reagan has asked for it, and many other people. We're just to the point where we're not going to be able to balance the budget on the United States without constitutional restrictions, without boundaries to do that. We're not going to get it through option A, which is letting the United States Congress propose it. So the way to do that is have a convention of the states to propose that amendment. My resolution calls for it limited just for that purpose, for a balanced budget amendment, and it leaves it open till 2020. So it's not going to be indefinite like the one in 1976. There are already 17 other states that have this type of amendment that's pending. This is model legislation from ALEC, model legislation that mimics the other states, so that we're all asking for the same thing, so we can get 34 states to do that. I don't know whether there will be another 18 states or 16, however many the math works out, that will go along with this. But I think it's the right thing to do for our country, and I don't think it's any risk in doing it. There has been a little pushback. I represent Walton County, and the Tea Party there is very strongly in favor of this. I do know that there are some other of the Tea Party groups that are not. The only grounds or argument against it that I've heard is some fear of a runaway convention, where the amendment convention might propose more amendments to the Constitution than just this one. I think those fears are misplaced. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding that the convention itself can amend the United States Constitution. It may only propose amendments. And so I don't have a fear, even if the convention did propose more than one amendment, you'd still have to have 3/4 of the state ratify that for it to become the law. And
Senator, can we stop you for just a moment and answer some questions?
Yes,
I know
sir.
you've got a very important vote to go make over there that I certainly don't want you to miss. I'm going to ask one quick question,
Sure.
and I've got several questions here of committee members, if you might. You mentioned $137,000 in debt per person. Just curiosity, do you have any idea how that compares to what the state of Georgia is?
I do not.
Okay, thank you.
I know it's greatly more than the state of Georgia, which is
Right.
should not have any debt other than the bonded indebtedness.
Sure. Chairman Powell.
Senator, I agree with you that there needs to be some limitation on Congress's ability, because they evidently have not shown the self-discipline that they need to show, in which we show because we have a constitutional provision that requires a balanced budget, and certainly we might not have been as strong as we needed to be if that were not in place during the recent years. But my question is this: how do we reconcile the call to Congress to exercise self-discipline and to spend money on fiscally sound basis and not to overspend their authority, when we as a state have dedicated funds that have been dedicated for particular purposes, and yet we don't show the same fiscal responsibility to spend those things on the purposes for which they were designated, and refuse to acknowledge that responsibility and put some strictures in place that would force us to do what we're required to do?
Well, you're making my argument for me. the state of Georgia.
I think he
even
was
though-
talking about House Bill
I know
811.
exactly what he's talking about. And the example is, even though we as a legislature or our predecessors have passed bills dedicating these funds, we don't follow them because those laws have no teeth in them without a constitutional amendment requiring us to do it. Or else we just have to have the discipline.
Or a
to
bill
follow
like
those.
811 that would require us to spend it
Exactly.
on those purposes.
So true.
And so when we're faced with a bill like 811, why will we not pass it?
I believe it's in our rules now, isn't it?
Yeah, with a restriction that'll basically never put it into effect.
Unless there's adequate reserves, I believe is that the trigger. on
Well,
that.
which has happened once in the history of the state of Georgia. But anyway, I don't want to argue the point. I think
Point made.
that we need to recognize that, before we criticize somebody else, we need to abide by the same rules.
We do.
Thank you. Representative Kidd.
Two questions, Senator. One, isn't it true that in the last 4 years, not only has there not been a balanced budget, but there hadn't even been a budget in
That
Congress?
is true. That's true.
And second, isn't this the bill that I got a call from New Mexico about this morning?
I don't know about that. Are they supporting it? I understand
They are supporting it, yes, sir.
several other states are doing the same thing, and there is an exception in this for national emergency. That in the times of national emergency, you could spend more than you bring in. You won't tire
That
hands
it?
too tightly.
All right, thank you. Representative Hightower.
He actually answered my question a while ago. I've had everybody say they were for this with one caveat. They were scared of what could happen at the convention, but you addressed that concern.
Yeah, I think that's been a misconception of many people not understanding what the constitutional provision really is. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Representative Powell.
My friend, and well, first I want to clarify, you do understand I wasn't here in 1976.
I wouldn't be surprised, but I have.
Even though I might have been tracking this process.
I knew that
And
you
I
had
will also
so much
say that
experience that I didn't want to say you.
But I'll also say in 1976, the old felt hat crowd that ran things were by far more physically conservative than anybody that we see or any group that we see today, because they understood what their duties were under the Georgia Constitution. A couple of questions. You spoke about the concerns of a runaway convention. As I understand the process, that once this is specifically called for, they can only deal with that one subject matter. Is that not correct?
There is a dispute amongst constitutional scholars on that point. The language of the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution describes these ways of amending, and the second way is to call this Convention of the States. And it says for the purpose of proposing amendments in the plural to the Constitution. Some scholars interpret that as you cannot limit it to just one. Others say, well, of course you can limit it whatever your call is for. If you want to have multiple calls for different types of amendments, then you could hear those. That, of course, has never been resolved because we hadn't had a convention, an amendment convention over the years to know. And so in an abundance of caution, in this language of this resolution, it specifies the purpose that we want. And I think the mechanism other states are talking about is we would have a resolution once there's 34 states, and it's because each state would decide how to select and send their delegates to this convention. It is anticipated that you would limit your delegates' authority. So we would pass, like enabling legislation for us, we would decide how to choose them, we would send them, and we would give them the charge that they were only authorized to consider a balanced budget amendment and be able to recall them if they exceeded the authority our legislature granted.
Second question, would you not also agree, and even though you're being far more courteous to the current makeup of the U.S. Congress and the Senate than I am, is it not true because of the dysfunctionality of the system in Washington today, including this thing that you have to have a 60% in the U.S. Senate to ever even talk about a bill, much less pass it, that this is the only possible way that the citizens can be heard on this issue?
I concur completely. I think that the federal government is completely dysfunctional now, and I think this is the only way we will ever enforce this because of that 60-vote rule in the Senate and the fact that the House has already voted against it.
And last but not least, as a distinguished jurist from Clark County, and also as a leader in the Georgia Senate, and I cloak what I'm saying with that, and I mean that in all sincerity, but as a leader in the Georgia Senate, do you not also agree that part of the problem that we see not only in Georgia but across this great nation, especially out of Washington, as water runs downhill from Washington down to the many governments,
No doubt.
that public policies are dictated strictly by spending, and for that possibility that it's so easy to continue to pass borrowed spending plans that we have basically heaped debt upon our children and grandchildren down the road, and this would probably be the best thing that we could to bring us back into reality of living within our means.
I concur totally, and that's the impetus behind this resolution.
And I want to I do want to thank you for bringing this forward.
Thank you, Representative.
And so while you still got the mic, is there anything you'd like to offer?
I would like to ask him about 880 that's in the Senate Rules Committee tonight.
We'll make sure.
I won't recognize you for that. So.
Tell you what.
We have a motion to do pass. Second. Any other discussion? Sorry to cut you off, Senator, but I think
That's
that was
fine.
you'll be
All right.
fine. All those in favor of passage of Senate Resolution 673 LC 255983, and I have to say it's not often that we actually see not committee subs, so good job on this. All
Thank
those
you.
in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. Measure carries unanimously. We'll get it turned in today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And who's going to carry on the House?
Andy Welch.
And
Unless
then
the chairman would recommend anybody
no,
else.
That's fine. And we do have another measure before us, the committees. So thank you, and go make your vote.
And was it 880 or 881 before I?
It is the Georgia Real Estate Commission's bill.
Here's the 811.
Listen, I'll let my cousin tend to his own stuff.
Thank you, Senator. All right, we have a little measure before us. This was Senate Bill 113, which was in our committee last year. And what we ended up doing was taking language out of that and putting it on another bill that ended up passing that we needed. And I had the opportunity. I also chair the Energy Subcommittee. And we passed out a bill out of the Energy Subcommittee several weeks ago. It passed. It went into the full committee and passed, I believe, unanimously. Went to the floor. It passed the floor. I don't know what the vote was, but we've already passed it in the House. We've had a little trouble over, I know y'all find this hard to believe, but we're having difficulty getting out of the Rules Committee over on the Senate side. So we've taken that language and put into Senate Bill 113. And I'm going to ask you to go ahead and come forward and present the bill as you did in the Energy Subcommittee, so that this committee, who's not seen this bill, can have a better understanding of why we want to move this forward. And this is simply a measure. It's no different. It's just trying to have another opportunity between the final days of session to make sure one of these gets through.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Why don't you, this committee's not familiar with some of you. Well, you probably are. That's all right. Go ahead.
Ashley Meggett with the Georgia Municipal Association. This particular bill, as the chairman said, it did pass the House unanimously. That was the final count. This one that you see in front of you just has one or two changes, which I'll speak to. The bill itself, though, is for the ability for state agencies and local governments and authorities to enter into energy performance savings contracts in particular. You may recall a few years back there was legislation that passed that allowed state agencies to actually enter into the energy performance savings contracts. It did pass very late in the hour in the day and in session, and so there were a few errors that didn't speak specifically to Georgia government and how our local governments act and so on and so forth. So it generally was a cleanup bill and was intended to just clean up some of the legislation so that if our local governments and state agencies are hoping to take advantage of energy performance savings contracts, they would understand how to and have more clarity as to how to proceed specifically.
Why don't you go ahead and tell us the two changes that were put in this bill compared to the bill that passed unanimously on the House floor?
Okay. There were two changes. I'll go ahead and speak to the one that I can speak to the best. It's on line 81, and that's page 3, line 81. We did have some folks come forward, specifically the general contractors, after it passed the House, and come forward and had a few issues with it. And we came out with a nice compromise to ensure that our local governments have some sort of process for putting these contracts out. The way that these energy performance savings contracts work is there's so much large financing behind them. Typically, you'll see the Honeywells, the larger companies, Ameresco's, those types of large companies that will come forward and help to finance maybe a retrofit of a building, maybe a retrofit of a city hall, and it's financed through energy saved. So in particular, we thought, if a local government does want to explore some type of project, we don't want it to be so cumbersome, but we do see that it would be fair that they would need to put it out for at least 2 RFPs and see what comes back. And that was a general contractor compromise with GMA, local governments.
So it says shall be required, so both ACCG and GMA are okay with that requirement?
ACCG did sign off on the legislation. I talked to their legislative council as well, so yes, sir.
And who's going to speak to the other change?
The other change specifically was up on page
Right. Those
4.
are the, 98.
Exactly. It was page 4. I was told it was to help with and this is, I will speak to it as best I can and represent it as best that I can. I was told it was to help with the expense that may come with preparing RFPs. So how cumbersome the process is itself. And that's what these changes were intended to do on lines 99 and 100, to make it so that there's not a lot of cost lost by the businesses in preparing the RFPs. And due to the comprehensiveness and the energy that would be saved, I think they have to guarantee some type of energy savings, and it was more extensive and would make it so that not as many people would want to possibly go out to prepare for the state agency RFP.
And since this is not the Energy Committee, should anybody on our committee read line 131 and want to know how many is 100 megawatt hours, you certainly will be able to provide that information, won't you, Megan?
If the chairman would be able to help me with that a little. I am told that
that's a lot of light bulbs, right?
Yeah, the energy threshold requirement down in 130 and 132. If we have any folks that worry about Georgia Power, this was a fix that Georgia Power did sign off on in the legislation, right. And 100 megawatt hours is definitely a lot. How do you like that? Please don't quote me on that. Does anybody have any questions specifically?
Any questions of Megan? No other questions? All right.
Chairman, I'd like to recommend to this committee that we pass the substitute to SB 113 as amended.
Great. That's LC 352709S. That's a motion. Do we have a second? Second. Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, same sign. Congratulations. Measure moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
You sure you don't want to testify, Marcy?
That damn power.
Meeting is adjourned and no more this year.